in climate policy initiative. So the paper I have written about whether business groups can create sustainable value for farms here in India. So if we see, when we discuss about sustainable value, it means that we are creating wealth for shareholders and maximizing profits. Actually, it's coming from the philosophy of profit generation is the solemn objective of farms. And even Milton Friedman, in his one of his paper in 1970s, he said that if any business which is looking at social responsibility as one of his agenda, he would not be competitive enough to compete with his competitors. So this influential business theory actually led the idea is that profit generation is the sole objective of business. So even if we see Michael Porter's 5 process model, uh, which says that which doesn't cover sustainable value in its business analysis, because if we discuss with any consultants, any analysts in brokerage houses or investment banks or consulting companies, so all of them are using Michael Porter's 5 process model, and Michael Porter's 5 process model does not incorporate sustainable value or all the stakeholders' value in its model. So next is value creation for sustainable finance. What it means? It means that when we are taking a business decision, it will take care of, it will consider environmental, social, and corporate governance issues in its business decision making. But what happens that when any business decision maker takes a business decision, it doesn't incorporate all these things in its business decision making process. Earlier, there was some assumptions that business ethics is considered an ethical business proposition. It's not translating into sustainable profit generating of a business. But as the power of the society, power of the civil society are changing, there is increasing concern among consumers also, among producers also. We need to take care of environmental and social these things into our business decision making. So there are ample evidence, empirical evidence also, which suggests that corporates who have incorporated ESG issues in their business making have positively affected the performance of the companies, and it improved their credit rating as well as it's helping them to lower their borrowing cost. So how value creation happens through sustainability? It can happen through growth. Growth means that when we are growth can happen either horizontally or vertically. It means that the company has to incorporate sustainability ideas into the products and services it's going to sell. Number two is that it's generating economic profit. It means that the return on capital employed must be more than the cost of capital of the company. So return of capital employed can be improved by charging premium on the products and services. If sustainability criteria is incorporated on those products, those corporates can charge premium, because there are certain classes of product, certain classes of customers who are ready to pay a premium to the products having sustainability attributes. So it can also reduce cost of production and operation by building a sustainable value chain and operations. There is empirical evidence of this hypothesis as well. So sustainable means better risk management. It means that if any corporate is incorporating ESG, it is going to reduce the regulatory cost. Because as we progress in the society, the government and the society as a whole is coming out more and more stringent regulation. It means that the corporate has to spend a lot of money in meeting the regulatory criteria of the government. If any corporate is reducing that risk, definitely it will reduce the cost of operations as well. So all these things boil down to taking a right business decision, which will improve, and the business can survive for a long period of time. So why I'm connecting business sustainability to corporate groups? If we see the compensation structure of management of the company, particularly the CEO of the company, it's not well aligning with sustainable objectives, because the compensation or the bonus of most of the CEOs are short-term in nature, and they are connected to the stock prices and short-term profit generation of the companies. And as the tenure of the CEOs are getting reduced days by days, it means that the CEOs are more concerned about making short-term profit rather than the longevity of the companies. It means that this kind of compensation it encourages business executives to save money in the short term, save in the forms of compromising the labor safety or polluting the environment, and some of the time they are taking excessive risk which is beyond the enterprise's capability. So they are totally ignoring the long-term implication of some of the business decisions they are making. So although it is helping the corporates in increasing the profits and increasing the stock price of the company, so ultimately they are getting more compensation from the company, but they are ignoring the long-term implication of some of the business decision making they are doing. So, but business groups are rightly placed to address some of the challenges. One of the reasons is that most of the business groups, particularly in emerging market, is family owned. And this family owned business, you will see that one of the traits is that the decision making are very, very long term. And there are also theories is that they are the permanent owner of the business. When someone is a permanent owner of the business, they will be concerned more about the longevity of the company and sustainable value creation of the company, rather than taking a decision which are very, very short term in nature. So this long-term orientation of business groups is well aligning with business decision making having long-term implication. For example, certain business which is polluting or which is not taking care of its labor, and it means that after a certain period of time, it is going to face more societal or business or regulatory pressure in the future. So these business groups, particularly in emerging market like in India, they are not only taking a decision which have long-term implications, they are also influencing business makers, so policy makers, to protect the interest for their own interest, because these business groups are highly diversified. They don't have interest in a particular company or a particular industry. They have interest in different industries. So if the environment is going to be more and more polluted, so it means that all the industries where they have ownership, it is going to be affected, and the government will come out with more and more stringent regulatory measures. It means that the cost of operation will increase. So in a way, business groups are there influencing policymakers to protect their own interest. It is indirectly it's helping the environment. Business group can also create sustainable value of business, as they have the ability to take decisions, because as they are the permanent owners or the long-term owners of the companies, they can take certain decisions which will increase the sustainability of the company, as well as they can formulate the right incentives and compensation structure in the company. It means that they cannot hire a CEOs and pay them compensation and incentives which is only going to increase the profit of the company, but expose the company to long-term risks, for example, climate risks. And they are also very, very concerned about their reputation, because the business groups, it's not for the last 10 years or 20 years. They have been in the business for a very long period of time. If we see historically, the business groups, because of their own good reputation, they are able to raise capital at a lower cost compared to the companies which have started recently. So they will always want to maintain their reputation and the goodwill, so it will help them. When they want to maintain the reputation and identity of the company, it means that they are going to promote the ESG things in their business policy decision making. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I think so. Two of you can collaborate. The earlier presentation was also on business groups from a different angle, and this one from a very different angle. Useful presentation, pretty focused. Few things. Within those few things, you were talking about value creation and some of the other bits. So I'm not sure if they are robust. So when we look at ESG, the environment, social and governance, how robust is this? Are you missing something, the economic side in this?
No, I have not done any empirical research
And the most challenging bit, or which is interesting, but the most challenging bit which I found in this, where you bring in compensation. Business groups, and you were talking about compensation, and we know private owned firms, how the directors or the owners and key people running the business, how they are compensated, and you are trying to link it with value creation. Okay? In reality, perhaps it doesn't work all the time, and there are a variety of reasons why the directors are paid, including tax-related reasons and so on. Okay? So, if it can be empirically tested, would be fascinating, but it seems like you are only talking about a conceptual paper where you want to propose something. Okay? I feel a lot needs to be developed, and this is an initial idea. A number of things which we were talking about earlier as well, the fundamentals, as I call them, the fundamentals on, is there a research problem? So it seems like the link between business groups and again, like the earlier one, what kind of business groups we are talking about, and if they are really creating value, and then linking it with sustainability. Okay, so is that really a problem, or you just want to do it, others have not done it? Okay, that's the one. What's the final outcome of this? Okay, that one is not really clear. It seems like you are giving lots of background information, which is needed, but how are you telling the world this is what you have come up? If you can, others can use it, or empirically they can test it. Okay, so you stop with some kind of conceptual explanation of number of things, without. If we ask about the contribution, what exactly is the contribution? We will struggle with that. Or how this can be taken forward, perhaps we will struggle with that as well. So I'll say a very useful start. Important topic, because as we move and the field on sustainability continues to develop and becomes an important agenda for more and more businesses. So business group in particularly, and especially if they are privately owned and so on, this is a gray area which needs addressing. Okay? So useful start, what comes and in what form, work on that.
Yes. I also like this thing that you're stepping into a new space, looking at sort of the issue of CSR in relation to business groups, which tends to be, I guess, an underexplored area. And I was also, of course, appreciative of the fact that you try to link it up to some of these Western notions that are being used, like ESG, value creation, etc. And I suppose that's how it must be done at this level in academia, but I keep wondering, this was also in your relation to your presentation, but certainly also to many others, that what would be an Indian-centric approach to CSR, if you really were to use a kind of terminology in the Indian context and make it sort of embedded within this society. What about issues like biradari, like the family networks? What about issues of caste? What about issues of ethnicity? I'm thinking that there are such things, maybe even from an anthropological perspective, that would be nice and useful to think about, perhaps also in relation to the idea of business groups, because I'm not really sure how useful the language we're using, the Western-centric concepts, to describe what's going on over here. Yeah, just a thought.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there's an interesting discussion going on at the moment about that has been going on for the last 10 years after the financial crisis, how we can move to a more long-term model of ownership of corporation rather than short-termism at the financial markets. And one argument, so for instance, Dominic Barton, the outgoing CEO of McKinsey, has written a few pieces on that in the Harvard Business Review and other places. And his point is, he was director before that of McKinsey in East Asia. So he said, you know, these companies don't think in quarters, they think in quarter centuries. And that includes, of course, a lot of business groups, right? So the question, I think, on which you could focus, or which would be interesting to focus, whether that hypothesis is actually true. Yeah? Do business groups who, you know, we can argue, and I think that's data, certainly in the Indian context, who have a more longer-term orientation, mostly due to their different ownership structure. It can also be state ownership, if you look to China. Doesn't need to be family. Do they really take into account the interests of stakeholders or more stakeholders? You know, and you could, you know, dream up a number of proxies how to measure that. You know? And I think that's a really open question, whether they yes, have a long-term focus, but mostly to keep the money in the family, basically, and don't care about stakeholders beyond that. You know, there are also these examples. So to test that hypothesis, whether differences in ownership and more long-term patient capital automatically produces a stronger concern for stakeholder interest, that's very much an open question which to test and find out could be a very interesting focus of such a study.
And I'll add one more point, since this might help you. We are increasingly seeing this tension as business groups become big and large. The challenge for these business groups is, do they keep adding family members on the board and key places? And increasingly there is a debate, and lots of business groups, when they bring non-traditional people on board, including daughters, including professional managers who were historically not coming on key positions. And then you can link it with the value creation. What happens to that?
I think, sorry, just responding, I'm just reflecting on the kind of questions the three of you are asking. And I think one of the, one of the things that I'm left with is that there is a bit of all of it. I think, how does one tease out this? And I was just listening to her presentation, and I was just imagining if she went out there to do some empirical work and actually picked the trading communities from the south of India and kind of contrasted with with somebody like the Tatas who actually came in and settled in Mumbai, and if you trace it with some of the groups from the north, huge variations in the way they actually, the Marwadis of Rajasthan who migrate to the south. So in a way it's interesting that the point you were talking about, a kind of, is there an anthropological perspective when we are looking at business groups in their assumptions of, is it profitability at any cost? Or is it giving back because I have migrated? I mean, so in a way, it's, I think what your questions are raising is that there is a certain complexity with the coexistence of multiple forms of CSR. And I think unbundling that, I think, is probably something for all of us as researchers to think about.
I'm glad to hear that, Vasanthi. I think that's what, when we were developing this call for paper, we felt probably these things might emerge because we felt there is a huge potential here. You know, when business groups work happened, a lot of work and on different dimensions and different aspects happen, from theoretical work to empirical. We have, if we get into the social responsibility side, there is again a sea of kind of things which might emerge out of it. Let's move. We have next presenter, Gurdeep Kaur. Gurdeep Kaur, sorry.
that's, I chose this topic because, okay, कहाँ से है? This is something I feel passionately about because I have been in the development sector. I have long back left academics, wanted to write something, so thought this was a very good opportunity to get feedback and use this opportunity to my benefit. And that's why, and since having worked in the non-development sector, in the non-profit sector, the government sector, and now as a consultant to corporates, something which I feel very strongly about. So I chose this topic and I'm going to go forward with this. The symbiosis between corporate social responsibility and stakeholder engagement. Since the way we do business now is drastically changing and all over the world, not only in India, so there are things that we have to look at stakeholders in a very big way. When we come to corporate social responsibility, the objective of this study is that I want to adopt a non-traditional approach and investigate corporate social responsibility from the perspective of stakeholders and the role they play in success and failure of a project, whatever it be in the corporate sector. So this is the definition I'm adhering to for my research project because there are a lot of definitions floating about. So I'm just looking at this as the corporate social responsibility. And this is the definition for the stakeholders which I'm adhering to that have stake in for any in the project. But when we come to stakeholders, we are looking at both kinds of stakeholders, internal and external. The corporate sector in India has always been looking at internal stakeholders quite a bit in concerns of their profits, their gains, their shareholders, the customers. We have market researches going on and to collect feedbacks and seeing things. So the internal stakeholders to whom they are directly impacting are often taken care of. But the external stakeholders who are impacted by the projects of the corporates, whether they are in the CSR projects or they are in the business profits by the business groups or the companies as a whole, they are generally being left out. Whereas being a developmental professional, we always look at the external stakeholders and take them into account whenever any social project is designed and goes through a whole project management cycle. The stakeholder engagement is very, very, is a key, to a success of a social development project. Whereas the corporate social responsibility, though it's been 4 years now, and the corporates understand stakeholders also in a very different manner. They understand it just directly with their own things. When it comes to external stakeholders, this is what I have felt when I have been involved in most of the projects, whether it was the research and rehabilitation project or it was the social return on investment studies, which I did in due course of my consulting things, that the corporates always, even though the CSR, many people are saying that they have a philanthropic attitude and there is a CSR compliance is to be met, even when they are doing CSR as compliance also, the whole attitude of the corporate is always that they are the givers and the people there down are the receivers. So, so they don't understand the stakeholder engagement of the external stakeholders in their projects. The stakeholder engagement considerations, it takes times and resources. So, and that is one reason why they are probably very, very wary. They have so many compliances to make, so many things to make. So these are the things I want to cater to as indicators while doing my studies also. It raises expectations. And if we talk to the stakeholders, this is what we are going to do, then it might raise, they might want more and more. They might start expecting, and that might create a problem for the corporates. The securing stakeholders' participation. If there's a sometimes stakeholders, there is a cultural blockage also. So the stakeholders themselves also are a little hesitant to participate in these kind of meetings. So the capacity building of the stakeholders will be something which I'll be looking into this. And the consultation fatigue, there will be a lot of work involved in it. So this will be one more thing. So companies, this is what I feel, and these are the things that I have to come out with in my study. We're looking at these things. I've used a literature, under the literature review, I've done this case study, I've done from the literature review of the Gas Authority of India Limited. And it was mainly to inform and educate the stakeholders to promote inclusive decision making and actions that in turn will have positive impact on the ecosystem. So the whole, it was completely through consultations which the GAIL did this and came out with beautiful outcomes, and they developed their own processes according to this stakeholder consultation. So this is the thing how it is done, the stakeholder, that they identified the key issues, the stakeholders were mapped, because stakeholders are also different classes of stakeholders come up even when, depending on the projects. If it's a construction project, or if it is a rehabilitation project, or if it is a water and sanitation project, or if it is in a rural village, or it's in an urban setting. So these are the things, we have under the stakeholder mapping. The stakeholder engagement, how the stakeholder engagement, the whole exercise has to be built, how it will be going about, and then analyzing the responses of all the stakeholders. This was what the matrix was developed for the Gas Authority of India Limited, and they came out with beautiful results. I, in fact, have not written over here something which in my study I want to incorporate, because for the lack of data and the time which I didn't have, I would further take it on ground. The two projects which I had done it, one was with the public sector unit. It was a rehabilitation project where they were building a power plant they are going to build, and I was a part of it in Odisha. So I am going to collect some data, then on ground build a whole questionnaire and see what the things were. Though I was part of it, that could be a biased view which I might give, so I would like to do that. And another one was the Jindal Steel's social return on investment study, again at their plant area, which I had done. So I have found out, when whatever I said earlier, get the corporates feel that way, was part of those analyses when I was part of the studies that I had got through. So I would like to reanalyze with the help of a questionnaire and see what the feedback is coming for the stakeholder engagement, so that a fair conclusion for the things, because I have a hypothesis that if the stakeholders engagement could be involved in corporate social responsibility in a good way, in a very defined way, then this goes a long way in not only benefiting the CSR projects, it also benefits the companies or the business groups in their sustainability and value creation. So this I don't want to take up, negotiations and partnerships and all. That is all I want to tell you. So what I said it already. Thank you.
Thank you, Gurpreet, for sharing your ideas. We can see a lot of consultants' language and passion coming into this, which is interesting to see. A few basic observations. You do use some kind of explanation for the core constructs here. So you have an explanation for stakeholders, you have some kind of explanation coming from your results about engagement and so on. So it would be useful to further explain for your research, here are my clear stakeholders. Because with each business, there will be common stakeholders and there will be specific stakeholders. Okay? So it will be useful to be clear and tell the reader, here are your boundaries, you are focusing on these key stakeholders. Second one, again in your analysis, you are pointing out about engagement. So how are you measuring engagement? Okay, what exactly engagement mean to you? Because to me, it might be something different. Okay, so it's a matter of capturing, hopefully, more comprehensively and more robustly what you are talking about. Okay, and then some of the other things. I don't know what this materiality metrics is doing, and how did you arrive at it, and are the contents or the subheadings or themes you are covering within that, is that a comprehensive list? So again, they look interesting, they look relevant to what you are talking about. From where have they come? And as I said, is that exhaustive? And the way to address this would be, once you draw some boundaries, that my focus is on GAIL, or my focus is on Brad, or my focus is on something else. And within that, you can talk about their supply chain management, supply chain as an example. You can talk about human capital, because let's say software versus GAIL or cement, perhaps the human capital would be again very, very different. Okay, so some basic observations, but some of the other comments which we have been sharing, they are valid here as well.
Yes. Well, I very much like your concern for sort of the, I guess, stakeholder engagement as being taken as very important and not just relating to how corporations engage with different stakeholders, but actually whether they can have a real voice and perhaps even influence on corporate actions. There were a couple of things that I was unsure about. I was not quite sure about which project was really being addressed in your research question. That wasn't clear to me, just from the point of readership. And the second comment that I had was that I was not quite sure whether you're writing a literature review or whether you're making sort of a research proposal. Because obviously these have different styles of writing. One is writing a literature review, the other thing is proposing to undertake some research and then following that kind of format for that. So that was, these were my two questions.
Yeah. One interesting aspect, I think, of your work is really the question. Just the fact that companies say they do CSR and have some pet projects and, you know, have a nice website even, or maybe even have a report, does it really mean that they listen to their stakeholders, or is this just something they do unilaterally for very narrow interest for, you know, improving their brand or, you know, stuff like that? So I think that's a very interesting question in how far stakeholder engagement and CSR are correlated and under which condition they are and are not. So that I would find a very, or that idea to pursue, I would really encourage.
Okay, I would just add to what Dirk said. In fact, you know, in most of the Western word stakeholder as a notion related to policy, practice and scholarship, it has matured. It has grown a lot. You know, you've used Freeman here. In India, we are yet to see that. So there's a lot of use, or I would say abuse of the term. But actually, it's not happening. And that's where the research is required. How do businesses, companies, when they claim stakeholder engagement, management, or whatever they do with stakeholder, how does that happen? How does one go about it? What kind of internal processes they have? What kind of external processes they have? For this, you know, designing and shaping this whole process. And I think, I have not seen any scholarship so far coming out of India, looking at these, you know, the kind of issues and challenges that come. I was invited by HP, you know, as a process of their stakeholder engagement. They invited me as an expert to kind of shape and drive the stakeholder engagement that they were doing. And their whole thinking has kind of demonstrated to me that they're serious about stakeholders. They are mapping their stakeholders. They are mapping their techniques of engaging with stakeholders. Given the kind of company they are looking at those kinds of materiality and then shaping and designing those kinds of things, which we are, I mean, from a community side, yes, we have, you know, Tata Trusts and Tata Funds and so many, every Tata company has a particular non-profit organization associated, which they use the developmental, international development kind of theories and practices to engage with communities and stakeholders. But that's been historically been there. Has that happened with others? When they went to Singur, did they do that stakeholder engagement? Just left to the West Bengal government and said, you know, you do the land acquisition. Our CSR starts once you have done that. So those kinds of things perhaps need to be looked at more. Yeah.
I was so pleasantly surprised, I don't know, pleasantly surprised or shocked, when I was on the Kotak committee to realize that the term stakeholder consultation actually is used by the investor relations department as a part of the corporate governance discourse. So seamlessly they kept using this word on the committee saying stakeholder engagement. And so I said, which stakeholder, in my ignorance? Obviously, because you come from a finance background, they think you understand, right? But when I asked saying, which stakeholder do corporations consult and how? They said, no, our investor relation teams manage. So it's a very interesting how this has been you don't know, call it hijacked or whether it has been we don't know what it is, but I think that's a whole new angle for people who are working with finance and policy, and it's an interesting one in itself.
It's a complete black box as far as India is concerned. We have not done research yet on these issues. So definitely I would encourage you to get into more depth. Of course, if you're looking at a scholarly work, then there's a lot for you to do in this. Thank you so much. Amit, you ready?
Just a couple of, I'll just spend 2 minutes trying to explain what I'm trying to do here, and then I'll go straight into my proposal. And I'm had this rare privilege of sitting in front of editors. So really, because I'm a hybrid person coming from experience of operational and academic background, worked in industry and in academia. So if I'm writing something, I need a moral driver. So what is my moral driver here? My moral driver is that I think that there is serious science data to speak about the unsustainability of the present levels of, current levels of production and consumption, of which I'm part of. So I want to do something about it and write something about it. That's my moral driver. It's an interesting phenomenon that SDGs have been signed and ratified by 193 countries, supposedly the biggest global ratification. Supposedly they're supposed to contain the climate change and other kinds of inequities. Is that really happening? And it seems that SDG number 17 is the game changer. That is collaboration. So this conference itself, it's called Corporate Social Responsibility, Collaboration, a key to SDGs. So everybody's talking about collaboration, and SDG number 17 is supposed to be the game changer. How do I assess? So what do I want to study? Because the current levels of production and consumption is unsustainable, who is the agency? Industry. So what do I want to study? The role of private sector between the rhetoric, the aspirations, and reality. So I've got two confusions: local focus, India-centric, or comparative focus. Let's say, for example, advanced country BGs versus local BGs. How do I assess? I want to study integrated report analysis of companies who are reporting on SDGs to understand the driving forces and therefore explain the difference between what they are reporting and what they are claiming to do. Why do I want to do this? Because I want to play a role, possibly, to fine-tune the policy framework, to impact on the contribution of the private sector to the implementation of SDGs, assuming that the SDGs is a robust framework which will change somehow the grim scenario projected by hard science. Okay, so with that, basically, this is my paper, and I'm here more to ask questions rather than to propose, so that I get a certain degree of clarity. And I would love some degree of clarity on what I will say. So, so I'm asking a question here. Why do firms report differently on SDGs and integrated reporting? A case study of Canada and India, and the contextual role of the private sector creating public good. Now, this is my first area that I'd like to ask the editors. I know from my research that firms are reporting differently on SDGs. There's a huge amount of variance, intersectoral and also country-wise. But do I do this comparative between two countries, advanced and developing, or do I just focus on India-centric and take sectors? So the research mentions why do BGs in Canada and India differ if I take a global approach? So substantively on the scale and propensity to report on SDGs, in their integrated corporate responsibility reports? Is it being driven by different perception of Canadian and Indian firms with respect to SDGs creating public good? Or is it being driven by different regulatory regimes like the CSR Act in India? Second, what are the similarities and differences of perception of public good between Canadian and Indian BGs? Could this be generalized to explain advanced country firm behavior on SDG reporting versus developing countries? Third, are Indian companies being driven to report more on SDGs because of the vagueness and lacking of clear indicators to report on their CSR compared to more developed internal reporting systems? So if I take this comparative approach, the research methodology that I'm looking at is develop a criteria to select BGs in both Canada and India, sampling, deploy a grounded research methodology by using semi-structured qualitative questions of expert informants, and then of course logically develop a criteria to identify and select who these expert informants are and which stakeholders should they come from, and conduct a content analysis of secondary research materials, of relevant knowledge literature and popular articles like newspaper, magazines, and do a coding to develop saturation analysis of certain emergent patterns between the primary data and the secondary data to explain the difference. What outcomes do I expect? Number one, develop a theoretical understanding of advanced versus developing country BG firms, corporate responsibility behavior, and approach to integrating SDGs in their reporting, whether or not they are integrating, and why. Develop a framework of how private sector contribution models could be different between advanced and developing country BGs. What impact do I expect from my preliminary thinking? Contribute to how SDG number 17 could play out differently in terms of private sector partnerships and contribution to SDG implementation globally. Second, develop a contextual framework of how different regulations like the CSR Act in India could be contributing to private sector to SDG implementations. I'm sorry about the redundant word. Implications are number three, implications for fine-tuning institutional governance frameworks like national voluntary reporting of SDGs to take into consideration different contextual factors. So briefly, I'm going to just show you some amount of research that I've done, and I'm sure there's much more. Just this. Okay. So, okay. So the basic message that I'm looking at is the UN Sustainable Development Goals are an innovative global approach, etc., which is trying to solve these problems, and it develops these sectoral, intersectoral partnerships. The SDG approach aligns well with the sustainable governance, and I've looked at some papers, environmental, social, economic challenges, and using a combination of instruments and institutions. At the global, national, and subnational level, SDG implement realizes on information inductance and isomorphic behavior. I'm sorry to use these technical, involving all sectors, in keeping with the concept of sustainable development. The theoretical underpinnings of sustainable governance to address complex, fast-evolving, cross-jurisdictional, environmental, etc. SDGs can perform a coordinating and synthesizing framework for addressing international law fragmentation. Goal setting such as SDGs can be potentially effective tool for orchestrating international agreements and institutions and legitimacy institutionalization theory. So I'm looking at some factual data that I've looked at. The KPMG 2018 report says, again, looks at the variance. 40% of the world's largest firms are referencing UN SDGs apparently in the corporate reporting. Of these, 84% identify the SDGs they consider most relevant to their business. Firms most commonly prioritize certain numbers in terms of SDGs. Least common prioritized goals are those. And then, of course, another KPMG survey says that SDG engagement obviously varies hugely. Germany, for example, is 83% versus USA 31%. SDG engagement per sector varies considerably again, per sectoral, as Vasanthi just talked about. So certain SDGs attract more business attention than others. The top three, for example, 13, 8, and 3. Engagement largely superficial at this stage and would benefit from having business-oriented SDG standard of some sort. Indian SDGs, talking about the India focus. India ranked 112 out of 150, all of us know this, and the Secretary General apparently praised India for a particular kind of all affordable sanitation and clean energy. The Indian CSR approach, conventional command and control law, and why I'm interested in Canada also because Canada and India both have emerged from a British parliamentary kind of a democracy and a common law, although Canada has code law, but then also it's also command and control, both in Canada and India. That's why I thought that it could be that comparative focus I have to take. That could be an interesting. Real Value of Indian Companies Act provisions that provide societal multi-stakeholder engagement and innovation and sustainable. Okay, so I've looked at the Tata, for example, and I've looked at the others. Oh, sorry. Oh, 1 minute, okay. So I've looked at some studies on Indian firms reporting on SDGs, and apparently they're quite sort of high in terms of proportions numbers compared to Canadian, for example. 2018 SDG goals, I mean 10 out of 17 UN SDGs, Indian firms have been adopting. Industry, innovation and infrastructure seems to be the most focused goal, 30% of the companies surveyed. The UN SDGs are not highlighted in this, etc., etc. So you can look at these, you can see this, that there is a very sort of, high focus. And in terms of Tata, which is always used as an exemplar, identified SDG activities under all 17 categories. So it's a very interesting kind of reporting. Identifies those SDG categories for which there are Tata business cases. So it clearly distinguishes between which SDG reporting is business case versus which are Tata CSR activities. And so this is my data on which I have formulated what I presented and those questions that I have in my mind, for which I'd like to really honestly get clarification. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing really broad ideas, and I think so it's a long-term kind of initiatives for your research you are thinking here, because what you are talking about, it's more like a research program you are on, and you will build on this and hopefully we'll have outcomes in the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years and so on. Okay. So the first observation, and depending on again what the other panel members have been talking about, is this a paper? But certainly this is more of a proposal. Okay, where the first question for me, and I feel more confident about raising this one, the comparative analysis. Okay, and then the simple question is why? And perhaps the answer is convenience. You have worked in both kind of setups and so on. You will struggle a lot if you try to sell this as a comparative way of doing things, because the two setups are very different. You need a much more stronger explanation, but I will not discourage you from not pursuing this. In the end, you will end up with wonderful data, so you can have Canada-based kind of publications, India-based kind of publications, and then now and then comparative kind of publications as well. You seem to have more information related to India, okay? Yeah, and then which means perhaps you can start with that side, and later on perhaps if the energy and enthusiasm continues the way you have at the moment, you can carry on doing that in Canada as well. On the comparative side, if you continue, then it will be worth controlling number of things, where the saying is, are you comparing oranges with oranges, or are you comparing oranges with apples? Okay, so you understand that. How do you get access? There is some conflicting views here. On one hand, you are talking about grounded theory approach. You want to go and explore and start as if something is not existing. There is so much of information which is existing. And then you were talking about the sustainable governance kind of theoretical framework which you want to utilize. So there is some kind of methodological and philosophical conflict here. So be aware of that. The access and time period. If that's what is your passion and it's evolving, I'll say create some collaborations. Life would be much easier because what we are trying to do is quite massive and big. And think of applying for research grants and having doctoral students who can work on certain parts of this. So sounds like interesting, having lots of mileage the more I hear from people in this room and other places along the themes. But there are challenges if you are thinking about a tight kind of comparative analysis, then be wary about the methodological challenges and some of the philosophical things which we need in a research. There also seem to be, there is a lack of clarity on that. But time period, what kind of time frame you have, because this might take ages, and is there readily available access where you can go and start getting the information?
Yes, what I liked about your presentation and explanation here was that there was this comparative sort of case study approach. I do think that there is some relevance and value to comparing sort of developed country settings and the influence on sustainability reporting versus, I mean, this developed versus developing country comparison could come in interestingly here, and try to see whether the institutional context in both settings have some kind of varied implication for what's actually being reported. I think one analytical trick that I'm sometimes using is in reading such reports is actually to look at, not look at for what is actually there in the reports, but for looking at what is not there, what is missing. You partly do it here, but I think this is something which is important and which could be quite systematically done, you know. Typically what's interesting about these reports is not so much what they're writing, but what is it that they're not mentioning. For example, certain impacts on human rights, labor rights, environmental issues. Typically in these reports, only very leading companies will actually be presenting sort of information that could potentially harm their corporate brand, no? So the question is, how trustworthy is it? And I think you can kind of investigate that by kind of looking into what is not presented in these types of reports.
Potentially be a very fascinating study, but I echo the comparative choice, the questions around that in particular, because you might find it very disappointing to look at Canadian companies. I think Canada scores kind of okay because governments and at federal and provincial level take these things reasonably serious. But for me, that's still, after 11 years, a big downer that Canadian universities, for instance, are totally into sustainability in business schools. Companies really suck, and they have so you might really find it hard to get data, right? Or you might confine yourself to a sector. You know, for instance, if you pick mining, you might be a bit more fortunate to find companies who do this. The second thing, and that goes a bit with confining, also in the line of what Pavan said, confining maybe the scope of the analysis, but linking it to some measure of performance. Because you can write a glossy report and use all the nice logos of the, SDGs, and that looks always great because they're so colorful in a report. But to actually find out if the performance that stands behind it is in some ways measurable and comparable. And I think that could lead to some very interesting then deeper questions.
Thank you, everyone, again. My suggestion, Amit, would be there are currently 2-3 call for papers out on the topic. I tried to find almost 6 months ago. You talk about reporting on SDGs. So besides the Tata report, the SEEK report that they have produced, I won't call it a report. There's a compendium of things that they're doing basically and they have looked at existing things and how that can be fitted into SDG framework and those kinds of things. I had hard time finding people. I could find 5-7 companies mentioning SDG. So at this moment, no one is reporting on SDGs in India, at least as I know. Now, the benefit of looking at the call for papers, of course, they are coming out of specific journals, and therefore they have shaped or tried to engage with the topic accordingly. But that will help you look at how different disciplines are actually engaging with the topic. So the engagement has started at the scholarly level, papers have started coming out, but how are they shaping the whole debate around SDGs is going to be very valuable for you to have a look. I'm happy to share, if you like, some of the 2-3 recent ones, currently open calls, which are there. And last year, I think a couple of them closed. So that might be helpful for you to kind of shape your thinking on how to take this forward. And if you're looking at aligning it to business groups, so that's another dimension that you're bringing in. So that perhaps you may find it valuable, and you might actually be able to fit it well to the currently open calls at the moment. Thank you so much again. With this we are done with presentations, and we have about how much time? 20, 30 minutes? No. 12 minutes. Yes. So we have 12 minutes, and if you allow me to extend it by 5 minutes, I want everyone, 3 of you, to at least share 5 minutes your views, if not less.
It might be useful if we have more Q&A. So people might be having all sorts of questions. That might be more helpful for everyone.
I'll go with the house. What do you think? We want to hear them, or we want to have question answers?
I just wonder whether there was an opportunity for us to see. One of the feedback consistent was the research problem.
Yeah.
So I just wonder whether in the audience we had some clarity on what could be the potential research question, or is there some thinking on those lines? Because I think that would benefit going back to be able to work on. I mean, that's my suggestion as I kind of sit here as a
That can feed in as a feedback for us to kind of think of.
I have a question actually. After going through all the presentation and interdisciplinarity of this topic also, there are a lot of confusion in public policy, looking public policy, then CSR, and then corporate governance. It's very difficult to theorize also. Sometimes evidence-based approach can be adapted, or most of the writings are coming also on experiential basis, on exploratory research or maybe ethnographic writing, rather than the theorization of CSR in global south context. That's the problem I have faced most of the writings which are coming. And that is kind of observation from my side.
Sure.
One of the things that came out from the panelists was that there should be some kind of India-centric understanding of the problem at hand. So I suggest that we want to hear more of that India-centricity that you have in mind, and you can spend each one of you 5 minutes that I will take it to you to talk about what do you mean by India-centricity and how publishable this is going to be. So developing a program is all right, but thinking of publications on India centricity has its own issues. So we would like to hear the editors and the people who have global experience.
Okay. Any more questions? Right.
I want to say, I'm an executive from the Tata Group. I want to give you some comments or whatever I have absorbed. I want to say that the Tata Group stands out by what is done early on in the years and continues to do. I have been talking to some people in the company, and one of the issues that they're dealing with today is how to map their CSR activity across the group. They're looking
software, and I don't know if it exists, or something in which every group company could put in whatever they do and come out with an index or come out with a complete measure, which could be compared year to year, or it would be compared within the group. So that's the next level that they want to achieve. They're also looking for something similar on the environment. So I wanted to bring that to notice that that's what this group is taking on as their next level. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that the global south, or India as a part of that global south, carries traditions, culture, social norms, attitudes, which are not coming into the presentation so far. So I'll be happy if the presentation brought that in some way. You mentioned that the theories of the West perhaps don't fit into our analysis. We need to come up with our own theories. But this is what will probably give us our theoretical information. So those are my two observations.
Any more comments?
Yeah, I can make a comment to what you said. So your first point, I think, for everybody in the room who's really interested to do something cool and new, measuring social impacts. Not in the way many companies still do it by saying, okay, we spend X amount of money on it, but to say we achieve this output. That's really one of the holy grails in CSR-related research. So if anybody is still thinking of the topic and you didn't submit a paper, that's, I think, worthwhile, and that, I think, combines then your second point with your question. Of course, the answers and the tools to do that are country-specific, right? Or very context-specific, as in CSR-specific, right? But I think they allow for interesting, generalizable, theoretical contributions, and I think that's kind of where we want to go. You don't want to tell a nice story about India. You want to contribute into our understanding how, for instance, CSR is understood in the West. I think that came out in your paper a little bit. Is it that voluntary American thing, or is it something else, right? That's a very meaningful contribution, and that can be based, if we make, as you said in your second point, customs, institutions, values, religious, tribal, other institutions, really objects of academic research.
And going back to the question, I think so this is highly important, and most journals are interested in the India story for good reasons now. I will put it in different words, the same things. What we are required to do at the moment, what is happening is we are pitching at a level to a specific audience which we believe, and to some extent we are correct, they understand all this, okay? Which is mainly the Indian audience. Okay? As soon as we are thinking of publishing it in leading journals, which many times are based outside India, where the audience is at times not only Indians but rest of the world as well. So the message which is coming back for the last, I think so over a decade now, and then we say contextualize your research. And these are the bits which helps you to contextualize. So if I look into this, we say, yeah, CSR, perhaps this is how it's reported in the literature. When we look into India, perhaps it's not only donations, it's not only charitable things, it's more humanistic things as well. And then the legal side is also coming, the legislation has also been put in, or the interpretation of when the whole debate about 10 years or so, it started here in the Indian setup, where it was more of a fashion for companies. And then I have lots of anecdotal data where some of the big companies, even in the city here, they simply recruited vice president CSR and so on. And these people were saying, what is CSR? So they have no idea. So that's the way we are talking about the setup in which we are examining the research phenomenon, which in this case is CSR or sustainability and so on, and what are the forces within which, or the setup within which we are examining this. Let's quickly revisit the comment where Western theories perhaps are they applicable or not in the Indian setup. It's worth looking into this. Majority of them are valid, but which aspects of those theories are more valid and which aspects are not helping us to capture the way we want to capture the research phenomenon. So when we look at this, I'll say institutional theory is very much helpful. Within institutional theory, which aspects would be more helpful, which aspects are missing, which can bring in the India-specific institutions, which can be a number of them, and the way they work, and so on. Or the stakeholder theory, yeah, it's universal, it's applicable. Which bits of that, same way. And then some of the other theories, they are valid, but they are not valid in the way it has been utilized in the non-Indian contexts. So the answer is not simply go crazy like, I don't know, one of the national parties here, that everything which West is telling is wrong. There is value into that, but it's worth keep asking what all aspects of those theories are relevant here. They are relevant, but some aspects, if we can pull out the indigenous side, which scholars are doing, example of developing scales which are India context specific. It takes much longer time, but that's a really, really useful contribution. So that's the way I will see how we talk about the India research, and that's a better way of reporting, not only assuming that the audience is this and everyone understands this. So take a step back, give some historical reasons and very clear reasons. If it's Tata, why Tata? If it's NGOs, why NGOs? If it's SMEs, because each one of them within the Indian setup have lots of unique characteristics. So highlight that. That would be really helpful.
Yes, just coming to this question of India-centric CSR, so I suppose that it does, on the one hand, as my colleagues are saying, assume familiarity with Western style notions of CSR and certain theories that are developed in the West. But I was wondering then, a little bit like Dirk was also saying, I mean, can we theorize the role of, for example, biratari in CSR in India amongst very big enterprises, very small enterprises perhaps? Can we theorize the role of caste relations in CSR within India amongst different size or types of enterprises? Can we theorize the role, I'm thinking more in Pakistan. My wife is from Pakistan, so I'm moving a lot around Pakistan. And I know that in many business communities, specifically amongst MSMEs, micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, the notion of honor is very, very important. And I have never seen any papers trying to conceptualize the notion of honor in community-based relations, family relations, and bringing that, how does that influence the entrepreneurs? Because I know for some of my family members and extended family in Pakistan, this means a lot. But I've never seen anyone trying to theorize or conceptualize that in relation to their notion as being socially benevolent entrepreneurs.
Just want to add one or two other comments. So what I'm seeing and observing, listening to the audience or presenters here, listening to audience and presenters in non-Indian kind of setup. So we have an interesting narrative which is going on. Okay, so here the narrative is very different versus the narrative somewhere else. So perhaps someone can, if do a research project on this, this is the existing narrative in different parts of the world, and try to bring it, you will automatically find lots of unique aspects. And that would be the India kind of story we are looking here. Someone can look at, thank you so much for commenting where Tata is and the challenge for them, looking in different parts of Tata and how they can integrate it and so on. Lots of majority of the companies are reporting and talking number of things on their mission and vision statements, especially about this. Okay, so pick it up and check, do a reality check. To what extent are they really practicing? Okay, simple research will give us really robust kind of messages.
Amit, I want to ask a question actually to the editors. So, would it be more interesting to ask a question like, what role does the Companies Act of 2013 play in driving Indian business groups to report on SDGs? Is that an interesting research question?
My take is from a different angle. Okay, perhaps it's a valid question, but there is evidence which Vimal educated me on. You start a ranking list. Okay, so you have different indices on which companies are participating and reporting. So it starts as, oh, we better be on this, otherwise the external stakeholders will not see us as good. Okay, so it starts with, for a wrong reason, perhaps a marketing or PR related reason, but later on companies start doing something meaningful on those aspects. So perhaps the question is valid, but look at what it has done in reality, which those developments might not have happened if this would not have come at the time it came.
I think, Amit, there is some research that we are doing on looking at human capital characteristics of women on boards after the regulation has come in place. Okay, so I'm just linking from there in terms of some insight. So we tracked 2014, 15 and 16 in terms of who were the women who came on the boards. And it's very interesting that the newspaper reports were really about the first year where they, just because Mukesh Ambani appointed Neeta Ambani, it kind of picked a whole host of stories which were all about these family women, sisters and mothers who came on board. But what do we find when we looked at the latest data that's come from the NSE listed companies? Close to, I think, 60% are women independent directors. Okay, and that's exactly what we wanted. So, I think in the short run, and which is why I liked in her paper where she spoke of violations. Okay, but it's also interesting that when the same set of findings were shared with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, they said we expected it because the board, in many cases, did not know what to do when they had large sums of money to give away and there were not enough NGOs and they required 3 years for prior experience of the NGOs to be able to receive funds, and therefore you'll see in that 2 years the maximum number of foundations got registered, and therefore in 2017 if we look at the money that was routed through the foundations of the corporation, it changes the dynamics. So in a way, I think I would look at a story on the SDGs. We just did a presentation yesterday on business and human rights, and I can tell you that if you track 5 years, it shows, there are some fantastic insights that are coming, whether it's for practice or for policy or for paper. It's just that I think just sieving through that data is a challenge. I think what do I confront as we look at it? Because there are several half-baked papers, which really is that when you have to collect consistent data, Proves gives you at 60,000 feet quantitative data, but the next one that we want, human capital characteristics of women directors, and I need CVs. Okay? And the CVs are not up on the websites. So then you go to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs for a fee, they will give you the Registrar of Companies. So now we'll have to look for that. So I'm saying the problem is probably the data collection and making it systematic, but I think there is a story there. That's my take at this point.
I'll give you another interesting example taking from you only. Picking from you, the morning presentation you presented a Niti Aayog mapping, ministry schemes and all that stuff. Story behind that is essentially when Niti Aayog realized they have difficulties getting structures made in states to work on SDGs and report on SDGs, they thought, let's start ourselves doing something because they have to report everything. And they're not able to create the government bureaucratic structures across different 20, 27, 28, 29 states and they have to report everything and nothing is coming out from the ground, let's ourselves look at the government schemes, central schemes, and map against the SDGs, which, like I said, Tata Group has done, looking at existing work and trying to map across the SDGs things. Now, you may, as a scholar, coming independently start looking at it's a reporting happening. So, I mean, it's an interpretation you are looking at a given, or the way people are managing at their end different kinds of things to go about dealing with these kinds of requirements and frameworks which are coming, which governments are being signatory to. So I think that's where we have to be careful in terms of what are we looking at, what kind of questions we are posing, what kinds of questions we are framing and asking. And how is that? I mean, reporting, as I said, is reporting at the moment, reporting is not there. No one is reporting. So that question, you will not get anything out of it. So the idea is, at this point, how are companies engaging with SDGs itself? How they are making sense of SDGs? How they're going about internally engaging the process of, it's 3 years, we don't know, nothing has come out. So I think those kinds of things, perhaps at this stage at least. Another even similar kind of, if you look at the CSR law, every year researchers are going about how much spending has gone up, how much spending has gone up, how much spending. Okay, fine, it's a good question to study. But we know that this is not going to happen immediately. 5 years down, we saw the data you presented. I mean, this is how it looks like. I said in the morning, when the law made, from 40, 50, which you could count, you know that 16,000 are in the remit of compliance. And out of 16,000, some will comply and lots of will not comply, and it will take them some years. So that's where I think the framing of the research question might come. And we have this Chief Sustainability Officer of Aditya Birla Group coming tomorrow to the conference. I would suggest you meet him. He has put together, gotten the software, which he has given it to companies across the globe. All the companies are expected to feed in the data. Now what's interesting thing is happening with them is, he has made it very interesting. He said, I don't expect you to do anything. I have this data requirement, just feed that in. Now when that starts happening, you have to start thinking, because you have to create those structures of data capture. And then you realize, and it's coming from the board. So every company CEO has to start thinking about, putting those structures in place to generate that data and feed that into, and then he made it competitive internally. So I think that's a good example. You should meet him. Tomorrow it's going to be there. Okay. I think we run out of time now. One thing which I had proposed in the call for papers was, one of the objectives has been to try and set up a research network on this topic. I would urge all of you, whosoever is interested, please approach me. We will work towards creating some kind of, we've seen, I think it's been encouraging what we have seen. We would want to grow this. And we have different forums which could happen. We have in Aston itself, we have conference annually happening in September, August, September. We have this year, British Academy of Management conference is happening in Aston, along with Aston India Center conference. So we could think of putting together another round of, work on, so those who are interested, we can look at different ways of connecting, engaging and supporting in this whole work and this whole area. Those who are at this moment, and it's not when we're talking about business groups and CSR or public responsibility, public good and social responsibility, it could have different themes coming out of, whether it's a CSR in developing countries, that is also connected, CSR in SMEs, that is connected, CSR business groups and different dynamics which we heard through the last few hours. So those kinds of things would be required for us to look at and engage with. So please contact me, drop me an email. We will work towards creating a vibrant kind of network for us to take this forward.
I have a very quick question. Is there any CSR research network in India right now? Plenty of CSR research networks across India.
CSR networks are there, not research networks. Research networks.
Plenty of them. Online you see.
We
I
have-
will send you the details.
We have, but not what you are asking.
Yeah, research network. Research network. It's a network.
I will go by what Vimal has.
We have it, but we not not what you do, what Jamali does, CSR in developing countries, institutional logics and those kinds of, we don't have it. This is what we have been trying for last couple of years to put together, and hopefully we will get
A
there.
whole lot of advisory firms have come up, to help the businesses reshape their policies, to set up their project design. Many of them. Gurgaon itself has many such companies that are doing evaluation studies, impact studies.
Though all mostly practitioner oriented, not scholarly work. Okay, thank you everyone. Once again, thanks to Amit for a great support for hosting it. Pawan, Peter, Doug, thank you so much for all your time, efforts, everything. Vasanti, thank you so much. Everyone, all of you have come here, contributed. This has been really, really great. Thanks Ria, Ravi for organizing this. We couldn't have done it without you. So really give them a big